So welcome back to this final book launch session. It is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Naushad Forbes, the current president of CII and co-chairman of Forbes Marshall. He's going to release the book. I'd also like to welcome Mr. Chandrajit Banerjee, the Director General of CII. He has really helped a lot with this book launch session. I thank you. I'll just take a little time talking about the book a little bit for friends who have joined in the last session. Our book is about political economy, and it's the political economy of growth. And the best way to get into the political economy of growth is to get in through what we call state business, what we are thinking of as state-business relationships. We all know that private investment and growth are significantly determined by the nature of state-business relationships. But our argument in this book is that, as opposed to the standard literature, in developing countries particularly, state-business relationship is not defined by what we think of as rules or laws. Rather, what defines state-business relationship in these countries are what we call deals, understandings, personalized understandings between the political elite and the business elite. And so it is, in a sense, personalized property rights that are guaranteed by political elites to the business elite so that investment and growth can take place. So in our framework, there are two factors that determine state-business relationships. The first one is political. The nature of political competition in our framework matters a lot. So the competition both within political organizations and between political organizations, what they do is they determine who's going to call the shots when it comes to getting into these deals. Who is going to provide the deals? That depends on who's important. And that depends on the structure of power in the political sector. The other thing that's very important for the deals space, as we call it, is the possibility of earning rent in a particular sector. And we have had a big discussion in the morning about what rent is, but basically what we mean is that higher than normal profits, which some firms may be earning because of privileged inputs that they get from the political elites. That's what we call rent. And what we argue is that in sectors where it is easier to guarantee or generate higher rents, the state-business relationship becomes one where fewer firms gets these privileges. So it becomes a much more closed deals world in our book. And finally, what we argue is that the interaction between the political competition and the possibility of these rents determine the kind of deals world that we have. In our book, we have closed versus open deals or ordered versus disordered deals. These are new terms, but you'll have to read the book to know what that means. But these are the factors that really determine whether there's going to be a growth boom in a country or whether the growth boom is going to be sustained or there's going to be a slowdown. And finally, what we do is that we use this framework and explain the Indian experience in growth. We identify 4 episodes, one of a very, the so-called Hindu rate, where growth was very slow. Then we had 2 successive accelerations, one in 91, 92, and the other in 2001-2. Finally, what we think is a slowdown around 2010. And we explain why these things happened in terms of the framework that I just mentioned. So that is the crux of the book.
Now, should we just release the book? Before we make it interactive, Professor Sen, would you like to say something? He's explained a little bit about what the book is about. I believe you also wanted to make some opening remarks.
The main thing I think we'd say is that to understand the nature of state and business relations, we have to try and unpack both the state and the private sector. I think the innovation that we did in this book and in the overall project we've been working on, and this is part of a bigger project on the politics of growth, I should also try and to sort of say there's a book coming out from Oxford University Press, which will have several of the country studies, including India, hopefully in the next few months, which has been edited by a few of us, part of the team. The point of the book that we're trying to do in this work is try to understand the state and the private sector in a much more heterogeneous way than has been done in the past. So if you look at the state-business relations work earlier, of which I was also part of, the private sector was seen in a much more homogeneous way. But we know the private sector has different asks of the state, depending on where they are placed in what we call the rent space. And that, I think, is important to understand then the dynamics of growth, because depending on which particular part of the private sector is asking for deals, and the kind of deals being offered from the political side, we understand exactly why we tend to see growth often starting and often also stopping. So we see the boom and bust growth that India's experienced in the last 50, 60 years. So that's important in the way we look at state-business relations and the way we think that going beyond purely a very homogeneous approach, the state and the private sector is very important in understanding growth.
Okay, so now let's just throw up the conversation and make it more interactive. What I did find very interesting when I was going through the book was that you said that the decade before 2010 was the fastest growing decade. That what we are, and since then we're seeing the slowest. We've not seen growth come back. But I also found very interesting was, and I'm not trying to give away too much of the book, is that you've explained GDP and how it's defined in India and how it's different. And that is very relevant today as well, because when the government today tells us that we're still the fastest growing economy, despite many speed breaks that we've had, between roadblocks we've had, whether it's demonetization, employment not picking up, appraisals not happening, but you're seeing indirect tax collections, for example, going up. It's a very relevant topic today as well, the definition of GDP. How have you handled that in the book? Would you like to talk a little bit about it?
Yeah, sure. So this was a challenge actually, because not only for the book, I guess for every Indian macroeconomist who wants to say anything about growth in India, we suddenly had a change in the definition of GDP, and which made the new numbers completely non-comparable with the earlier numbers. So what we tried to do is to say that we're not saying that that set of numbers, that definition was better or this definition is better. But even if we accept that this definition is all right, does it still show that there was a change in the underlying dynamics of growth? And we argue that we do see that, whether you take the old definition of growth or you take the new definition. And so that was sufficient for us to argue that something else was happening in the economy right now. And that's what we tried to explain.
Tarun Das, if I could just come to you right now. You just heard what he had to say about the political elite, what he had to say about the business elite, and how you have the private sector trying to increase its rent by taking as many privileges as they can from the political elite. And today, if there is one black hole in the economy, I would say it is perhaps the NPA problem that you've had, and it is based on the many privileges that some of the business elites have managed, thanks to the political elite. But aren't you in the business of having higher rent? It's just about maybe you're not supposed to get those privileges. The privileges should be the same for everyone. But when the state has not evolved, when the state has not evolved to make it easier for you to work in a good environment or does not provide a good environment, what are you supposed to do?
I think that it's simplistic to say that the private sector is all about just asking for more, like Oliver. I think most of the projects which we are talking about, which are delayed, where there are time and cost overruns, are complex infrastructure projects. they're not necessarily manufacturing projects. They're definitely not in the services sector. So they're essentially in the infrastructure sector. And there are delays on account of land availability, delays on account of credit availability, and multiple other things. Could be power connections and all of that. It could be a central issue, it could be a state issue, it could be a combined issue. So while private sector definitely seeks incentives, I would put it that way rather than rent, for investments in X state or Y state or Z state, a lot of the follow through doesn't necessarily happen the way the project has been planned. So there's no hero and villain here. You know, there are many hands at play, and I would therefore say that we should not pass judgment, rapidly on this issue. It's been a complicated time. Public-private partnerships were new to India. We were not ready for it. From 1947 to 1997, all infrastructure was government-owned, government-managed, and government-controlled. Dr. Nitin Desai is sitting here, and Dr. Bhagwati says, I mean, they've been in the government on the other side, and they will understand that government actually ran entire infrastructure, and there was a culture that infrastructure was free. So, this huge issue, power will be given free to farmers. I mean, this culture was there. So, viability of projects is not easily achievable in infrastructure. And the problems have been.
So we shouldn't look at villains. And while we are in the august presence of people who've had very good, very high positions in government, it's very easy to look back and then criticize. But there were scarcities that might have been created from the government's end. For example, this book has talked about telecom. So let's talk about telecom, the spectrum scarcity. We didn't have to have that. We didn't have to be where we are today. Had there been enough spectrum for everybody, right? But very, like I said, it's very easy to look back today and say, oh, well, retrospectively, we made a big mistake over there. But do you think we've learned the lessons?
So I think actually we have learned the lessons, but the way in which the book talks about the way that the book describes the lesson that's been learned, it's to stop doing those closed deals and not replace it with something different, right? And so there's a slowdown, there's a reaction to, I think, which is described in the book, a reaction to those closed deals. And then the reaction to then leads to a slowing down of subsequent deals. All those sectors constitute what one would call infrastructure. And we keep talking about how as a country we need much more of investment in infrastructure. And infrastructure is precisely the area of the phrase that you use, rent thick, right? So infrastructure is precisely those rent thick sectors where you need to have perhaps the same kinds of closed deals because they're I think, again, a phrase that's used in the book, I think, where you say that's non-tradable. So now I think, but there's another piece that I wanted to actually bring out, because how much of, if you look at the three phases, you have a pickup in growth, and you talk, both of you, which by the way, I like the book very much because I learned a whole new language. But you talk in the first phase about in a very sort of complementary way about entry of new firms, structural change taking place in the economy, that leading to the pickup in growth. In the next phase, you talk about growth picking up much more, but you're much less complimentary about what's actually happening in the economy. You're saying the growth that's picked up is because it's come from these rent-thick sectors. It's come from, at the end of the day, a lot of investment. And all of that investment in these infrastructural sectors is exactly what we keep saying we need as a country. So the question is, how do we have both the high levels of investment, which infrastructure will indeed call out for, and those investments are going to be in sectors that are non-tradable and therefore subject to less competition and so on. So how do you get that without this, closed door deals, a strong sense of corruption, reactions both in society and from various audit watchdogs and so on, and then everything comes to a standstill or slows down very significantly. Yeah, so that's the first question. And then the second question that I had was actually around, if you take the nature of productivity, could one argue that the sectors that grew rapidly in the 90s, in the growth pickup, were actually sectors where the potential for long-run productivity growth is much greater?
No, and I thought there was also low base effect at play.
So there should be a low base
There was a low-
effect.
like, for the
Yeah?
sectors they talked about.
There should be a catch-up possibility and so on. But I think also these are sectors like manufacturing where the potential for long-run productivity growth is significantly greater, it seems to me, than some of these rent-thick sectors like power or the energy sector, the communications sector, perhaps, and maybe some of the service sectors. So I'm wondering whether there's a technology and productivity argument that could also be looked at in a useful way. And a last question has to do with foreign trade and the trade environment. You talk about closed door deals and you imply corruption.
No,
If
they
you
said
look,
crony
you say crony
capitalism.
capitalism
They did say it quite a few
in the book.
times.
So if you look at the experience of other countries, look at the experience of South Korea in the 60s and 70s, or China in the 90s and 2000s. Both those periods of sort of long-run decadal growth, 2 decades of rapid growth, I think at least in all studies have been associated with crony capitalism, high levels of corruption, but very long-run, significant growth which doesn't run out. And the difference seems to be that a lot of that growth came from manufacturing. So you have the technology and productivity argument at play. And second, that growth came in sectors, in things that are traded, in things where you are especially exporting, and because of exports, you have the discipline that is forced on firms of efficiency, which you do not have in these infrastructure sectors. So I'm just wondering, if you add the dimension of productivity and technology, and if you add the dimension of foreign trade and the trade regime, would that help explain the non-sustaining of growth? And is there a lesson in there for what we need to do going forward as an economy to get growth going again, in terms of, again, worrying about technology and worrying about exports?
I think those are excellent points, and I really actually agree with almost everything that you've said. There's been a particular place in the book, and this was mentioned in today's discussion, where we have clearly said that closed deals per se are not a bad thing. There are closed deals and there are closed deals. And in fact, the South Korean example is the shining example we have of that. I think one of the things that the book tries to show is that it's not only that the fact that there were rent-thick sectors. The problem was at the same time you had the political the space in a very weak position with one party without a majority and 18 or 19 other parties in the alliance. And what happens is, if you have rent-thick sectors, and particularly closed deals are very critical for infrastructure, for example, and they have to be something. And in fact, I come back to this point later. But what happens is, when you have that together with a certain kind of political situation, then the possibilities of what we call crony capitalism just goes up, and that's something that we have to be aware of, so that we don't actually make the same mistakes twice. But at the same time, I think we agree that currently we have 7% rate of growth, right? 6.5 to 7. But if we really want to go back to 9% that we had in the previous episode, we do need closed deals, and we need to balance those closed deals with open deals in a way that will allow this growth to go up. Without the closed deals, you cannot go beyond 7% probably.
So the question that the that I have is that if you look at, if we want to go back to that growth rate, I agree, we do want to go back to that growth rate. But what would it take? Would it take, how do you bring about those closed deals in the right, in the right kind of, in the right kind of environment?
Are you convinced by the South Korea example?
Yeah,
Are
so
you convinced by that's a closed deal that has worked and has delivered?
I mean, I think if you read descriptions of South Korean growth in the 60s and 70s, it's full of closed deals. I mean, the descriptions of how the chaebol were given special privileges um, and protected, and they delivered. They delivered. I think, and there were clearly indications of corruption. I mean, South Korea has the distinction of uh, putting in jail several previous precedents because of deals done with chaebols, and the current head of the largest single chaebol. So it's that's a reflection of closed deals, but the sectors that they were operating in were somewhat different. I think there's a difference in terms of, they were tradable sectors, they were export oriented, they had the discipline of the market, which we didn't, I think, have in these sectors.
Point really is that Korea, of course, is exceptional, and the problem is always you keep on going back to Korea as an example, and I don't think that's very helpful. It's a very specific country, very specific institutions. The political elite had amazing enforcement capabilities, and they did move to open deals at some point, maybe if not a lot for some time. Remember that it was a fairly authoritarian system, so there was no political pushback, which simply cannot be not in India. You cannot imagine that. Really. In a, Yes, yeah. So what the two things? One is that where we are in society in terms of third-party institutions which push. Second is which particular sector where you have this closed deals. But then think about two other countries, and we've been working. I was thinking this we're doing this work around different countries. Think of Malaysia and Thailand. So Malaysia and Thailand in the 1990s were seen as two countries that are going to come into middle-income status very, very soon. What happens? 1996, financial crisis happens. Korea gets hit. Indonesia gets hit. Malaysia and Thailand get hit. Korea recovers very quickly. Indonesia doesn't also for very different reasons. We had a change of regime there. Malaysia and Thailand are now in a situation where they have a permanent growth slowdown. And the argument we make in a separate work is to link back to this question. You really can't have what they did in Malaysia and Thailand, where they had closed deals for the power broker sector and the rentier sector in Malaysia, the rentier sector, not so much Thailand, and open deals for the Mediterranean sector, which is mostly multinationals, electronics and so on, for too long. Because at some point, that whole deals environment simply has a finite timeline. It doesn't work. So you've got to keep on moving towards an open deals environment, even across all sectors. You've got to move into more transparent mechanisms of giving license and so on, even in the sectors where you have infrastructure, you have mining or whichever sector where there is a possible pollution clearance. So the point really is that yes, you can have closed deals, yes, you can get growth, but the problem is that you can't get growth for too long. And to use Korea as an example that India could be like Korea, I think is mistaken because it simply isn't really possible given the nature of the way the political elite interacts with economic actors here, where you can't really imagine the disciplining mechanism we saw with the chai balls in the case of Korea. So I think that's
coalition politics that features very heavily in your book. Concentration of power, distribution of power. Do you want to expand on that?
Yeah, so I think what has been proved with the 2002-2010 episode is that politics and political power actually goes beyond political parties. We had a very strong pushback from, for example, the Anna Hazare movement on corruption. And so I think to answer Naushad's question, what we really need is a consensus on closed deals so that they are closed but they are transparent and that we all understand that they're necessary and exactly who's making what amount of money out of those deals. And I think there's No. The closeness,
Well, the terms of the deal should be transparent.
transparent, exactly.
At least at the end of the day, I mean, after the deal is done, it should be transparent. What about in this year's economic survey, Arvind Subramanian makes this argument that he says, we, as a country, we have three meta challenges, and his second meta challenge is this. I forget what he calls it. I think something like tenuous relationship with the private sector or something like that. That there's this sort of on again, off again trust of private capital and of markets, and that he sort of makes this argument that unless we address that, we will not, for example, be willing to move and address our NPA problem, because anyone who tries to address the NPA problem will immediately be attacked and said, "Listen, you did a deal. What did you get out of it?" And so, how do we bring about that? How do we bring about that change? I mean, one of the ways is by having certain rules that you would put down. But if you're doing closed deals and you have a closed deal environment, and there are these sectors where you will have to do closed deals, how do you handle those? I mean, are there any examples of that in other countries?
So, as I said, we haven't found in all the country work we've done, we haven't found examples where you could mix the deal for too long. Well, I mean, again, one should be careful. Malaysia and Thailand did it for 20, 30 years, but sooner or later you run out of steam. And the
But
point really,
China
But
would
it's
be a
very
good example.
different. Those are much smaller countries. It's
Chi-
not diverse.
China.
China. No, I didn't.
but I think the other point, I think the thing
No, I
that's
said
being
China.
lost,
Oh, you say China. Sorry.
the thing that's being lost here in the discussion of closed deals.
Yeah.
The thing that's being lost is that
No, but the government in China is very different. It's not
Yeah.
fair to compare.
Also distinguishing totalitarian systems.
Yeah, it's very
Because even
different.
Korea in the old days.
Yeah.
was
Would you give up your something that you take for granted for that growth rate?
Depends on who you are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But can I just say one thing that the point again, we do not have a normative vision of closed deal being a bad thing. The point that has to be kept in mind.
Little louder. Hariku Jore.
I think that will work now.
Point the point that should be kept in mind. Yes, it's not. Yeah,
Now it's on.
Is that closed deals are a situation where you do not see institutions improving, and perhaps also depending on sectors. So closed deals, let's say rent-thick sectors, there really isn't an interest on the economic actors to ask for rules. Why should they? So from the point of that, economic actors, there is very little interest to actually ask for rules. In fact, often they are more interested in having weak state capacity, because less discipline, the less regulation, the better for them. And on the other side, for political elites, simply there isn't any interest in asking for rules or regulation that work, because they benefit from the sorts of deals they have with economic actors. So closed deals, the problem is not so that they have a normative vision of it. The problem is that if it is there for too long in the wrong sectors, if you wish, it can be a situation where it doesn't lead to better institutions. And at the end of the day, we all believe, in the long run, the best way to get growth and development is have better institutions. On that, there's been a lot of work, as one knows in economics, that ultimately the way to think about getting into a middle income or high income status is a better institutions.
So
The
that's
question
the
is, how do you
minimum
get there?
government? Maximum governance?
No, I think we need a very close, different kind of close engagement between government and industry. You see, we've tried the public sector commanding heights of the economy model. Okay? It didn't work. Maybe we didn't handle the public sector right. I think we're still not handling the public sector right, because I think we have a lot of public sector and they could contribute to growth. And so that's a different story. So we are left with this model of a so-called mixed economy, but the private sector has become central to development and growth. I think the rules of engagement, the transparency on policies and processes must be developed through dialogue between government and industry. I don't see today a consultative structure on policy between government and industry. I'm a bit far away from it. But even earlier, there used to be a Prime Minister's Council on Industry. They used to meet. It was both sitting together, Prime Minister, ministers, senior officials, senior people, and they were discussing policy work and processes. I think we need to bring that back in some form, maybe in a new form, with a new name, but we have to engage with each other and find a way through this more, as we don't want crony capitalism, we don't want corruption, but we do want the government and private sector to work together for development and growth. Otherwise, where are the jobs going to come from? Okay, there are going to be a lot of jobs in the new economy. I mean, and that's the future of jobs, is another different story. But even from existing industry and small and medium enterprises, we can get a lot of jobs going, a lot of development going. But there has to be a much closer interaction between government and industry. I don't know whether the Ministry of Small and Medium Industry, for example, what is the structure for dialogue for engaging the private sector? What is it? I mean, at least it's not out in the open. Maybe you should do a story on that.
But just coming back to what, just to play the devil's advocate, what if the government came back to you and said, you're talking to us about having consultations, but you're not even increasing your capex, you're not investing. It's the government which is having to pump prime the economy.
So that's so how do you? The question is what makes it attractive to invest? I mean, the first thing that you need is enough demand, right? And I think at present, if you look at overall capacity utilization in the economy, we're probably at around 70%. And I don't know. I have no basis for this. And if you can come up with a theory of it, that'd be wonderful. But I have this sense that there's a threshold of around 75 to 80% of capacity utilization where the new capacity starts being created if animal spirits are high, and if the animal spirits are low, then maybe it's higher. Maybe it's 85-90% capacity utilization that you have to hit before you start creating widespread capacity. So that's sort of I have no factual basis for that sense. It's just a sense. And so I think we're still below in capacity utilization, below the first threshold, the threshold where widespread capacity would be created on the basis of demand.
So you're risk averse.
Yeah. I think we're going to be running out of time, so I'm going to give the last word to the two authors. Professor Sen, if I could just ask you this, that when we saw the coalition politics at its peak, you're saying that it is also coinciding with the highest growth rate that we've seen. Isn't that a bit bizarre? Because then wouldn't the electorate have voted back the people that were making them economically secure, were giving them a much better time?
That's the real puzzle, because absolutely that we had a situation where we had high growth rates. You'd have thought, and from what the data suggests, also poverty was falling, maybe for other reasons also. But clearly, and that's I think the important part that the book tries to make in an indirect way, obviously there was a rejection of the kind of this environment that led to the growth story. So the point really is, it's not so much the growth that we saw in that period, it was the nature of institutions which were seen as politically illegitimate. And so if you were to try and think of going back to that kind of growth, the question then is, will society, will the wider economic, set of media, so on, accept the kind of institutionalization we saw in that period? The answer is probably not, because they didn't certainly accept it once. And so I think the point we are trying to make is that people have often seen the growth, that particular growth period, as being a good thing, and it is if you look at growth, and if you look at poverty and any other indicators. But if you look at the institutional environment, it wasn't a good thing, and certainly.
That's when you notice the crony capitalism was also much higher.
And certainly the way it finally turned out, with both the slowdown, which also one should keep in mind. We didn't talk about that so much today, but really the fact that that kind of closed deals environment led to a disordered deals environment post 2010 was something which, in the current context, we really haven't gone back to a situation where we have escaped the disordered deals environment, as one can see, because there is no political consensus yet on what kind of deals environment we would like to see. So the point really is that it's institutional arrangements which are quite important, and one shouldn't simply look at growth per se or anything else that comes with growth. You don't understand how politics shapes growth.
No.
No, in fact, let me put it slightly differently. If you want sustained growth, then it's the quality of growth that matters. The problem, or there's something about these closed deals which make them very attractive to policymakers or political elites, because they give you very quick growth. They give you high growth rates of growth very quickly, because there are very large profits to be made in these sectors. But usually what we find, not only in India but in other countries, that it's the sustaining of that growth that becomes difficult. And so on an average, in the long run, you'd have much less growth than you would have had if you had avoided this trap. Buy the book.
Yeah, everything is not being given away.
Thank you. I think I have to thank everybody for this fantastic turnaround. And we had a full day's program today. Exceptional interaction and a lot of good debate. And I hope that we can keep doing this and keep coming back. Thank you.